there is no reliability, there is no stability. Look what they just did to Ukraine. So, alliances are, I think, in inverted commas at the moment, and that's a very terrifying prospect.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to Michael Weiss, an investigative journalist, author and editor of The Insider, which is a Russian-focused media outlet. And we discussed the meeting between Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin's thoughts on that ceasefire deal brokered between the US and Ukraine. That's coming up today on the Trump Report. And remember, you can watch us Monday through Friday, every day on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Michael Weiss, thank you so much for joining us today on the Trump Report. Let's get straight into it with the news that Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff has left Moscow already this morning after arriving yesterday, but that he did hold a meeting with Vladimir Putin, and the Kremlin says that Donald Trump and Putin will speak at some point in the future. Now, we don't know when that is going to be yet, but Michael, what have you made of the last 24 hours?
Well, it's interesting. They apparently met into the wee hours of the morning. Witkoff left Moscow, headed to Baku. There was no real readout or press statement about the meeting, which certainly indicates perhaps it didn't go as swimmingly as Mr. Witkoff would have liked. But I think the bigger issue here, or the broader story, I should say, is that the Kremlin has decided that Witkoff is their man for doing business with the Trump administration. Keith Kellogg, the general who was appointed by Trump to be special envoy to Ukraine, has been in effect sidelined. I mean, he is playing second fiddle to this real estate magnate who's got quite a bit of money invested in the Middle East and who is meant to be, sort of Trump's envoy to the region. He was party to the outgoing Biden administration's negotiations between Israel and Hamas for the release of hostages in exchange for a ceasefire there. But he has no background whatsoever on Russia-Ukraine, which is precisely why I think the Russians prefer to do business with him, because he's more easily manipulated and rolled than a guy like General Kellogg might be.
Yeah, so you mentioned Keith Kellogg there. Like you said, it was reported that Russia specifically asked him not to be there. The Kremlin have since denied that this morning. What do you think it is about the caliber of the man that Russia might not want at the peacekeeping table?
Well, he's an old Cold War grizzled general. He's quite pro-Ukraine in his personal position. His daughter actually is she runs an organization that, among other things, helps American volunteers who'd gone over to fight on behalf of the Ukrainian army and repatriates the bodies of the fallen. So I think it's sort of a family affair. The Kellogg's seem to be very much on Kyiv's side, and the Russians simply won't like that for obvious reasons. They he'll be advocating on behalf of the victim in this war and not sort of espousing this neutral, if not slightly pro-Russian disposition that seems to be kind of a through line of the rest of the Trump administration, from Marco Rubio to the National Security Advisor Waltz to, I mean, certainly Witkoff, who has described Putin as a friend, or that they had friendly relations after their first meeting in Moscow several weeks ago. Witkoff has also taken to the airwaves to suggest that Russia was provoked into invading Ukraine. And these are talking points that are very common on the far left and the far right, but also, I mean, talking points that have been cooked up in Moscow as part of its disinformation campaign to justify the full-scale invasion. So it's a bit eyebrow-raising. Actually, I should say alarming that Witkoff is the main interlocutor here. But how long that lasts, I don't know, because it doesn't seem like the Russians are getting everything that they wanted. This ceasefire agreement, which was unconditional, as agreed to by the Americans and the Ukrainians, is already being mucked about by Putin, who is insisting that all military aid to Ukraine cease as a condition for entering into the ceasefire, that Ukraine not mobilize its forces and not engage in any military training. These are conditions, I should add, that the Russians do not seem to want to impose upon themselves, only upon one party to a ceasefire. So already we're beginning to see some kinks and hiccups in this grand design to stop the war.
So picking up from that, when those talks do eventually happen between Trump and Putin, like I said, we don't know when they're going to be yet. What exactly is going to be on the table, and how do you see those going?
Well, Trump is making a big play at, or making a big deal of seeing Putin as a trustworthy negotiating partner. I mean, rather famously in term one, he said that he believed the Russian president over his own intelligence services. And I raise that now because just today, the Washington Post has reported that a new intelligence assessment dated about a week ago suggests that Russia has not given up its ultimate aim in Ukraine, which is the total domination of Kyiv. Now, whether they're able to do that militarily, which looks to be a dim prospect, or they aim to do it through what I suppose you would call hybrid warfare or active measures, political domination. They clearly want Volodymyr Zelensky out of the cockpit, which was, another sort of big talking point of the Trump administration up until quite recently. Um, Putin has never given up on this sort of whole-scale incorporation of Ukraine into his Russian empire in the remaking. So he's gonna push for that. And the question is, does Trump now defer to his own intelligence community, which is essentially being governed and overseen by loyalists? I mean, I would even use the word cranks who have engaged in conspiracy theories, many of them pro-Russian, including Tulsi Gabbard, who is the director of national intelligence. To what extent, and this is a conversation I'm having with European security officials and former US intelligence officials, to what extent is the full suite of American intelligence being perhaps watered down or tempered because Donald Trump famously does not want to hear anything that puts Russia in a negative light. I mean, that was a kind of cliche from term one. So there are a lot of variables here, but the Ukrainians came out well from Jeddah because their main objective was to put the onus on Moscow and have them be the ones to either affirm or reject a ceasefire. And I mean, you're seeing essentially a rejection of that ceasefire. It's not about nuance or subtlety. They're saying no, we won't do this unless you cut Ukraine off at the knees preemptively, which of course the Ukrainians will not abide by, and I doubt even the Europeans would. I mean, if America stops military aid tomorrow, again turning off that spigot, there's nothing to say that the European Union and a host of other countries, including the UK and Norway, won't continue to provide ammunition and weapons assistance to Ukraine.
You said in response to that ceasefire that Russia still hasn't given up on its war aims. Do you think Trump and his security services are aware of that? And if so, what is the end goal for Trump here?
I think the security services are absolutely aware of it. I mean, intelligence professionals are meant to be doing objective collection. It's not a biased thing for them. But again, the crucial question is, does Trump believe the CIA, the NSA, his own intelligence community, or does he take the word of Putin at face value? And everything in his history suggests the latter, not the former, which is quite dangerous. You know, Donald Trump, I think, and I don't mean to be engaging in dime store psychology, but whatever, everybody seems to do that these days with respect to the president. I think what he quite likes about Putin is that, Putin is a strong man. Nothing really stands in his way. If he wants to invade or annex another country's territory, like Donald Trump seems to want to do with Greenland, perhaps even Canada, the Panama Canal, he just does it. If he has internal or external opposition, he deals with them either through co-opting them, bribing them, or killing them or imprisoning them. And I think, if Donald Trump had his druthers, he would very much like to do the same thing. And what stops him, of course, is whatever is left of American democratic institutions. But I think he has a real, sort of tropism to this kind of form of authoritarian dictatorship. And it doesn't just apply to the Russian president. I mean, I think he likes the cut of Viktor Orban's jib for the same reason. President Erdogan in Turkey, even Xi in China. I mean, there was a big hue and cry made that this administration is going to be quite hawkish and tough on China. But actually, the mood music is that, if Taiwan were to be invaded tomorrow, America wouldn't lift a finger.
And the Kremlin's official statement said that there was cautious optimism over the deal, but that there were nuances, I think, were the word they used.
Yeah.
If he is just sort of playing for time, as it seems, what is Putin's next move?
Well, that's a good question. I think the problem the Russians are going to have is that they're quite aware that if the United States were to agree to all of these conditions, I mean, keep in mind, the Ukrainians got to yes on a ceasefire because the withholding of security assistance and intelligence sharing for their offensive and defensive capabilities was turned off. So America already used this as a cudgel to get Ukraine to the table. to turn off the security assistance and intelligence yet again as a way of getting the Ukrainians to abide by a 30-day ceasefire, I see no reason why Kyiv would assent to this. Nor do I think that the Europeans, particularly the British government, which acted as sort of a negotiating third party between Washington and Kyiv to get the Ukrainians to this point, I don't think they would tell the Ukrainians, advise the Ukrainians to go along with this. I mean, it's a trap. It's to weaken Ukraine's military mettle and its defensive posture, to allow the Russians to regenerate their forces and to resupply and to produce more weapon systems and heavy armor and the rest of it. Breathing space is beneficial to both sides, but it would be especially beneficial to the Russian side if it had no such restrictions that it's trying to impose on its enemy. And I think that's quite clear. And one thing to keep in mind here is at a certain point, the Russians will become um, enervated and impatient if they don't get what they want out of, by what all accounts is the most pliant and amenable government they're ever going to see on the American side. There is a strategic realignment taking place, I think. I think Donald Trump is very clear about that. He has picked fights with two NATO allies, Canada and Denmark, threatening military action against one, and is already talking about the other as though it's a 51st state. He has slagged off the European Union as some kind of hostile racket looking to shake down the United States, imposing tariffs on the EU. He really wants to destroy or weaken the transatlantic relationship that has abided for 80 some odd years. The American security umbrella in Europe, I would say, is gone now. Article 5 is being treated already in rhetoric as some kind of pay to play, sort of transactional deal, as opposed to, an adamantine clause of collective security. This all kind of goes to the thrust of what I think is the overarching geopolitical framework of this government, which is they want to have rapprochement with Russia. And Ukraine is either a means to an end or an obstacle standing in the way of that end. And insofar as it's an obstacle, it exists to be abased and punished and threatened,
And,
as all our allies seem to be threatened these days.
and do you think that is how Trump and the people around him see it, just as an obstacle?
Yeah, I mean, the National Security Advisor just got up on television and said Russia gets to have or gets Donbass in any kind of full final settlement.
Mike
I mean,
Waltz is
this is
his.
sort of extraordinary. But yeah, I mean,
Mm.
first of all, the Russian military cannot take all of Donbass with the full might of the Russian state and its now, I mean, essentially war economy behind it. I mean, this is one of Putin's frustrations is that an invasion that was meant to be done and dusted in about 2 weeks' time is now well past the 3-year mark. For the United States to, and again, we don't know if this was intended as some sort of de facto acknowledgement of occupation. I mean, similar to the U.S. posture with respect to the Soviet takeover of, say, the Baltic states after World War II. It certainly sounds, though, like it's meant to be a de jure thing. So it's an extraordinary state of affairs that the United States is bartering away a sovereign country's territory in order to, get two parties to sign on the dotted line. That doesn't happen very regularly. So yeah, I would say it's quite clear what's coming out of this administration is, you know, our friends are only so good as what they're doing for us at that particular moment in time. But there's no such thing as an alliance. There's no such thing as a permanent partnership. Bilateral agreements are there to be relitigated and renegotiated all the time, which is one of the things I think the Ukrainians realize about this minerals deal, which was, remember that was the main thing for the Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump, which went sideways very quickly. What's to say if Ukraine did sign a deal with the United States, that if their territory is taken over in some new push Russian military activity in the East, where a lot of these mineral deposits are based, what's to say the U.S. doesn't just tear up the agreement with Kyiv and sign a new one with Moscow? If we're handing over the Ukraine's territory to the Russians, there's nothing to stop Trump from doing that.
So what you're saying here, do you think the US still sees Ukraine as an ally and vice versa?
I don't. I don't. I think Ukraine, and I've been trying to convince the Ukrainians and the Europeans, frankly, that, the party is over, at least
Mm.
for the next 4 years. I don't know if the damage that is done here is irrevocable. Maybe it isn't. I can well see a lot of countries sort of breathing a sigh of relief if we've returned to the status quo ante with the new administration. But for the time being, I mean, put it this way, if you somehow manage to get into Donald Trump's good graces, and this is a classic sort of phenomenon with any autocrat or authoritarian, you set your watch and you wait for when the scales turn, right? And when things go bad again. There is no reliability, there is no stability. And already we're beginning to see sort of bat squeaks of European recognition of this. I mean, Portugal, for instance, saying they have no intention now of trying to acquire F-35s from the United States because the United States could simply turn off the switch or render these systems useless by not providing spare parts and logistics and all the rest of it. Look what they just did to Ukraine. So, alliances
Mm.
are, I think, in inverted commas at the moment, and that's a very terrifying prospect, particularly if you're a frontline state in NATO and in Europe. I mean, the Baltic states are, sort of beside themselves now, wondering, if little green men turn up in Narva, Estonia, is the United States going to be there for us? Is Article 5 going to be invoked? And, I have to say, it doesn't look to be the case.
Well, on that, how is Trump's position on Ukraine doing with Republicans back home?
It's very interesting. I think, the party rank and file among the sort of political establishment, the elected representatives in Congress and the Senate, I mean, are very terrified of him, terrified of falling afoul of him, terrified of waking up and seeing him denounce them in a Truth Social post, terrified of being primaried with the coffers of Elon Musk behind Trump and sort of the MAGA juggernaut. But there are signs of hostility and opposition. So a lot of these Republican congressmen are now going to town hall meetings in their local constituencies and being absolutely savaged. And savaged by people not just Democrats, but Republican voters who probably did vote for Donald Trump. And one of the things that they're being attacked for, apart from this sort of Mafia Don style shakedown of Denmark over Greenland and Canada, why are you beating up on a vulnerable ally in Ukraine? So, foreign policy
Mm.
tends not to be a decisive factor in elections, but Americans, I should hope it's still the case. They don't like bullies, and right now they see their president acting as a bully. Whether or not this has any kind of staying potential, or whether or not it's going to affect the midterm elections in now less than 2 years' time, I don't know, and I don't want to hazard a guess. But it is interesting that Republicans are now living not just in terror of Donald Trump, but in increasing fear of the people who got them elected and put them into power. So that might be a sign of life in the old republic just yet.
As you say, it's still early days before the midterms,
Yeah.
but I think Trump has suffered quite a significant drop in the favourability polls. Does an issue like Ukraine poll well with the American public?
Most Americans are favorably disposed to Ukraine. In fact, I've seen interesting polling data from the MAGA sort of element in our electorate, which was never really pro-Russian. There's a very virulent and loud strain of Putin apologetics within MAGA. Don't misunderstand me, but the broader voting population, not exactly pro-Russian, but skeptical about being pro-Ukraine. However, if they are shown evidence that Russia is bombing churches or attacking or kidnapping or torturing priests, all of which the Russians are doing. In the occupied territories, there's not a single Catholic priest remaining, according to the head of Ukraine's own Catholic church. When they hear stuff like that, they bridle and they become more pro-Ukrainian. So I think Ukrainians are very much inclined to show that, no, I mean, for all the sort of, you know, God, king, and country kind of talk that Putin
Mm.
likes to telegraph to the Americans in the West to make himself a sort of bulwark and defender of Christian conservative civilization. In fact, he doesn't care a fig for religious freedom. And, someone in holy orders on living in Ukraine who is a Ukrainian patriot is just another enemy to be murdered or disappeared. So that has some potential. But look, I'm sorry to say again, Americans they feel a lot of solidarity. They support continued weapons assistance to Ukraine. But can I sit here and comfortably tell you that this takes precedence over, for instance, the price of eggs or
Mm.
gas at the pump? No, it doesn't for average Americans. But that it ever was thus, right? Foreign policy is a secondary or tertiary consideration.
We know that Donald Trump likes to be considered the man at the heart of any deal. But after
Hmm.
everything that's gone on this week, do you think he's opened himself up to some weakness and frailties? I think you said earlier this week that he didn't understand the deal that he was agreeing to. And
I
I
don't think
know,
he did. Yeah. I mean, again, this notion that suddenly now it's the Russians' turn to say no, to defy him, and then what? Either they get taken to the woodshed like the Ukrainians did, or Trump simply carries water on their behalf. Sorry to mix metaphors there, but I mean, so it puts him in an awkward spot because as much as he, as I say, has this kind of tropism toward Putin and wants to be chummy with Putin and wants to have rapprochement, he doesn't want to look like a chump. This guy is his entire aura, to say nothing of his political career, is premised on being a tough negotiator, the author of The Art of the Deal. I mean, this is his whole sort of shtick. So if he looks to be had, or like the Russians are eating his lunch for him, or that he's just giving up everything, making all concessions in exchange for nothing, well, then it starts to eat away at him. And I think his constituents too begin to wonder, well, wait a minute, you were the guy who was going to end the war in 24 hours. You were going to do this grand bargain with the Russians and the Ukrainians, and you can't make it stick. And, keep in mind, this is a man who keeps banging on that it's harder to talk to the Ukrainians than it is to talk to the Russians. Well, what have you got to show for it from talking to the Russians? We opened this interview with you asking me about Witkoff coming back from Moscow rather sort of sheepishly without anything to write home about. Yeah.
and obviously we've had that response from Moscow and the Kremlin to the
Mm.
ceasefire deal. If that eventually turns into a flat no, we're not going to accept a
Yeah.
ceasefire deal under any circumstances, where does Trump go from there?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Either he's sort of intimated that he is prepared to play hardball with the Russians. He would impose more sanctions. He'll arm Ukraine to the teeth. I mean, I remain skeptical of this point of view. I should say there are pro-Ukraine elements, particularly in the Republican Party. Mark
Mm.
Thiesson at the Washington Post who insists that actually no, Trump is not pro-Russian. He is, he wants to get a good deal for the Ukrainians. This is all posturing. He wants to appear neutral, if slightly pro-Russian, in order to sort of lure Putin, get him to lower his defenses and all of that. I don't buy that because, first of all, if that's the play strategically, I think it's stupid. The Russians don't respect that kind of weakness and that's kind of lickspittle servility. I mean, John Bolton they liked, they admired, and they respected because he was tough and they couldn't get one over on him. If they feel like this is sort of too easy or that Trump is too malleable, they also get paranoid and start wondering,
Mm.
well, why is it? Why is he being so nice to us? Surely this is some kind of power play or some kind of strategic gambit. I mean, the Russians often like to see stupidity where I would say they had better look at incompetence or, kind of short-sightedness. So this has the potential of just very easily blowing up in his face. But the question is, what does he do from here? If he is really going to back Ukraine to the hilt, you would think there'd be some messaging to that effect. And so far, we're not really seeing that. It's quite the opposite.
That's interesting you mentioned John Bolton, previous guest of the Trump Report, might I add. I was going to ask, is there a way to negotiate with Putin? You just said about John Bolton being tough. Is that the best way to do it?
I think so, and you have to threaten him. I mean, the Russians were very fond of their so-called red lines with respect to this
Mm.
war. Everything that the United States at the time, beginning in February of 2022, had not given, but was perhaps beginning to consider to give to Ukraine from HIMARS. I mean, even before that, towed artillery systems like the M777, then HIMARS, then long-range bombs, then cluster munitions, then ATACMS, then F-16s, then Abrams tanks and Strykers and so on. All of these things were going to lead to World War III, and they didn't. And I think, the man in the street even was able to realize that the best instrument or weapon that the Russians have as a deterrent is information and the threat of doing something that they actually don't follow through on and do. Now, there has been intelligence suggesting that at one point the Russians were seriously considering perhaps using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and that weighed heavily upon the Biden administration's calculations. Well, fine. It weighed heavily until it didn't, because the Biden administration has basically given the Ukrainians everything they've asked for.
Mm.
I remember being privy to a shopping list provided by Ukrainian military intelligence in April of 2022. Literally every weapons platform on that list is now in the hands of Kyiv. So I think, there's enough data points, there's sufficient evidence here to suggest, when the Russians howl and threaten and bang on, and Dmitry Medvedev takes drunkenly to Twitter talking about, imminent apocalypse, say, thank you very much. You pat them on the head and you say, here's our policy and here's what we're going to do. And here are your options. Dictate terms rather than, sort of ask them what it is that they would like to see. We all know what they would like to see. They want full conquest of Ukraine. Well, they can't have that, or they shouldn't be able to have that, I must say. And if your policy is defending Ukraine, sovereign and independent, allowing Ukraine to maintain as much sovereign territory as it can, if not to recapture some of that territory, and admittedly, that's also a dim prospect at the moment, because militarily, I don't think they have the capacity to do that just yet. But do not recognize occupied territory as now part of sovereign Russia. Do not certify legitimate annexation. And also keep in mind, Russia is in a very poor state economically, militarily. I mean, the Kursk occupation, which is now drawing to an end. At the time, a lot of analysts were saying, well, this is foolhardy. This is a distraction. It's going to deplete Ukrainian resources. No doubt it did deplete some Ukrainian resources, but it also depleted Russian resources, which was why they had to, field North Koreans to throw into the meat grinder there. The former head of Estonian Foreign Intelligence, Rainer Sachs, does a daily briefing. In one of them recently, he noted that about a third of Russia's glide bombs, which are one of the most devastating weapons that the Russians use against the Ukrainians, that a third of glide bombs were being dropped in Kursk. So Russia was busy bombing its own territory, taking some of the pressure off Donbass. And indeed, I mean, in the east, the situation is largely stabilized, if not gone over to the Ukrainian side. They've waged some very impressive tactical counteroffensives in cross direction, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar. We're not really paying much attention to that now because we're too wrapped up in the fandango of what the Trump administration is doing with the Russians and the loss of Kursk. But there you have it. The Russians cannot sustain this war indefinitely, which is why I think they want to kick the can down the street, bide for time, figure out a way to get the Americans to essentially neuter Ukraine to allow the Russians to go forward more easily.
Michael, I'm sure we could talk about this for hours, but I just want to end with something slightly different because it has been another massive week. We've had that visit to Moscow, we've had that ceasefire agreement that we've just spoken about, but we've also had increased tariffs and a trade war between the US and some of its closest allies. The president buying a Tesla in support of Elon Musk's, fears of a recession. I just wanted to ask to finish, as a journalist and as an American, how do you go about making sense of this all?
I mean, it's all kind of theater of the absurd. I mean, literally, our foreign policy with respect to our closest neighbor and one of our strongest allies, a NATO member, a Five Eyes member, has become the South Park movie, come to life. I mean, it's threatening military confrontation with Canada and getting the Canadians, who are some of the loveliest people on the planet, to boo US sports teams and to actually have a dripping contempt for the United States, and I don't blame them. It's sort of ludicrous. And people in the military are telling me, actually, we're not paying close enough attention to Panama because there are active preparations underway at the Pentagon level to try and retake the canal by force if necessary. I mean, so part of this you could argue, and this again, this is assuming any kind of coherence or logic to what Trump is doing. I think he's driven by impulse, and and sort of these sort of impressionistic perspectives, which then attain the level of policy by diktat, essentially. But part of what you could argue is that, look here, look there, look here, but don't look at what we're actually about to do. So if it is a kind of game of distraction, that's certainly, one thing to be even more on edge about. Tariffs on the European Union. I mean, look, again, Donald Trump does not believe in abiding relationships or alliances. He thinks that countries that have fought on behalf of the United States. And remember, Article 5 was invoked once by our country after 9/11. Every country in NATO went to Afghanistan and fought and bled and died on behalf of the United States, including our closest ally, the United Kingdom, including France, including Germany, for which deploying military resources and troops was no small thing. The Estonians lost more soldiers per capita in Afghanistan than any other country. And this is a country that people think, if Russian tanks rolled over the border, that's it. Goodbye, Estonia. We don't, JD Vance wants to see some appreciation and gratitude from Zelensky. We don't show enough gratitude and appreciation for our allies who have been there for us. And we treat them like, I mean, to use I think it was General Kellogg who said this, and I couldn't believe it because I don't think he believed a word of what he was saying. But he compared Ukraine to a mule that had to be battered with a 2x4 piece of wood into submission. I mean, this is how we're treating all of our friends at the moment.
Mm.
And I'm glad to say, and my advice to Europeans is don't take this sitting down. I mean, don't let the United States treat you this way. This too shall pass. And, if this is the moment that you choose, and I think you should do, to get your own house in order in terms of security, spend more on defense, realize that, you know, Trump term one was no aberration. It was no one-off. There's something systemic. There's a pathological rot in American politics. It may not go away with the end of this president's term. Now is the time, I think, for Europe to kind of stand up on its own 2 feet. And by and large, I'm seeing only indications that Europeans get it. I mean, look at the deal that Germany just struck today, the Christian Democrats
Mm.
and the Social Democrats, to basically lift the strictures on debt in order to spend more on defense. Good. All to the good. I think, this is long overdue, and I'm just sorry. I think it's deeply unfortunate, and I speak as an American here, that it took this kind of thuggishness for the scales to fall from people's eyes. But I think that the future of Ukraine is going to be in the European Union, even before NATO membership, which is now a very distant prospect. And I think European countries are going to be largely responsible for protecting Ukraine, not only from Russia, but from the United States.
Michael Weiss, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report today.
My pleasure, anytime.